Hi, I'm Robert Connor, and I'll be presenting on introductions in a presentation. This is our second part, or follow-on to introductions in a more interactive environment. So, how do you do an introduction in a presentation? Well, the goal is the same as in an interaction or when you're talking to one person one-on-one. It's to make yourself relatable, have your audience's attention with you. So how do you do that? Well, one way is to have some type of hook, something that engages your audience. A classic hook is a joke or an interesting fact. I think for my hook, I'll say something like, today I'll be presenting on presenting. It's not really that funny, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be some small thing to get your audience to think about what you do. The second part of your presentation is to say your name. So I'd say, my name's Robert Connor, Director of English as a Second Language. Now, if you have a name that is different than your audience is used to, so it's maybe not your typical American name, or it's a name in another language, what I'd suggest, even though there's a number of things you could do, is to say it the way you normally say it, Robert Connor, but perhaps to slow it down a little bit. Robert Connor, just a little bit slower. And I'd also think about saying it in the more Americanized way, like a second time. I'm Robert Connor. People call me, like Robert Connor, or something like that. Or whatever people call you in a more American accent. Because that's what your audience is going to hear usually if you're teaching to, or if you're talking with a group of your typical Americans. In their brain, they heard it the second way anyways. So I'd suggest doing that. That'll help them to understand. And if you want to teach them how to correctly pronounce your name, you can do that over time if you have a relationship with them. All right. So what are we going to talk about in presentation? Well, I believe we're on the third point. Your hook, your name, and now some type of thesis or some type of introduction to what you're going to do. And so my thesis would be, I'm going to be presenting about how to introduce yourself in a presentation. And when you introduce yourself in a presentation, you have a body posture, you have a certain format of the discourse, and you have your hook or your thesis, what we just did. And so what I just did, your name, your thesis, your hook, it forms the bread. And you're going to do that exact same thing at the end. Exact same thing at the end of your presentation. And that forms your other bread. All right? Well, in the middle, what do you have? Well, in the middle, you got your meat, Everyone buys a sandwich for the meat. You get a chicken sandwich, you get a hamburger, You don't buy something because of the bread. You don't get a wheat burger, something like that. All right. And so in the beginning, you give a summary of what you're going to do, your thesis and such. At the end, you restate that thesis, you restate your main points, because that's the last chance your audience has to really know what it is you're trying to decide. And in the middle, you give all the messy details. And that's kind of where we are now. I'm trying to give you all the messy details. If you're going to be realistic about it, your meat probably looks a little something more like this. So you got this little tiny bread, your little introduction right here, your little introduction here, or your little conclusion here. But most of it's taken up by the details, the messy stuff where you get into exactly how you should stand, or exactly what you should say, or in my case, exactly what your discourse structure would look like. All right, a couple other details. We talked about the structure of the discourse. What about your body posture? So in general, you want to avoid moving around too much, maybe a little less than I've done right now for a web video. How do you do that is, if you look down, my feet are standing like this, which allows me to do all kind of movement. But if I move one to the side like this, it locks me in place a little bit more. It keeps me a little bit more fixed, which helps when you have a camera that's not moving around. The second thing is what to do with your hands. You want to avoid the fig leaf where you're like this. You want to avoid standing at attention too much. So the classic pose is to kind of have one hand resting here and one hand like this. And what that usually turns out to be is one hand that's kind of at your side and one hand that holds a marker. So you can do some type of limited gestures that are to emphasize the important points that aren't too distracting. All right, and so we just did intro. I got into all the messy details, and now I'm going to do one more review for all those who I've really confused. And that review says that When you introduce yourself in a presentation, you have the same goal as an introduction in a meeting or when you're meeting a person for the first time. You want to get their attention. You want to, in this case, tell them something or communicate a message to them. How do you do that? Discourse structure and body posture. What's your structure going to be? Introduction, details, and conclusion. And this say your thesis or your message, says your name, and hopefully it has something to get their attention. Your body posture, the idea is you want to limit your movement too much. It is good to look at your audience. You want to avoid looking too much to the side or too much looking down. All right, that's the basic review of what we talked about today. And thank you very much.